And we have to say hello?
No.
Or is that part of like...
We're just here.
Yeah, I guess we should say hello. I mean...
Yeah, right. Thank you so much for having us today.
Welcome.
We're A.S.T. We're going to try to seem vaguely professional.
Yeah.
We are an ongoing collaborative of artists, architects, and curators. Incidentally, all women, as you may have guessed. The focus of our work is interdisciplinary thinking of cities, structures amidst globalized neoliberalism impacted by climate change. The project began in Miami, and the bulk, though not all, of the projects we have done have been there, and is the context that we know best with regard to sea level rise. However, we understand these conditions are planetary, and we are committed to thinking them problems as such. We are interested in understanding what sort of translation is necessary between sites based on economics, culture, geology, politics, etc., and between scales, the abstraction and scale that enables our contemporaneity to function versus the scale of lived experience. Most of the work we do is within an art context. And in 2018, we were offered to do an exhibition at Art Center South Florida, which was called Intertidal.
Intertidal refers to the zone in between tidal marks. It's the territory that's above water during a low tide and below water during high tide. And we took this condition as an impetus for the project and as a way to describe kind of the liminal condition that we inhabit as citizens of a coastal city.
We first came across the term actually from Kim Stanley Robinson's book. What is it? Is it 2112? New York. I have it actually on a book.
2040.
Behind this green screen, which I could sneak. But what's the title?
2140.
2140.
2040. ASR.
Yeah. Anyway, it was through reading him that we came across, that I first came across the term, and sort of it became sort of the one of the drivers for the exhibition. I mean that book more generally. So these are just some images from the exhibition, from the install itself. It was a 4-channel video installation. One main screen in the middle that had most of the text, and then the 2 screens just to the right of it, and then a projection, a mapped projection off to the side. We wanted to have a feeling of around like a control panel, a control room kind of thing, but also more information you could possibly manage, really. You know, giving that feeling of a control room that you probably have no control over, in fact. So one of the main ideas around the exhibition was thinking about time more broadly. And it takes texts and inspiration from Claude Shannon, via Charles and Ray Eames, quotes from Benjamin Bratton, Kim Stanley Robinson, as I mentioned, amongst others. And the sound is mostly from Yanis Xenakis. The narrator of the video is addressing you. It's all text that you have to read. It doesn't actually speak to you, but it's addressing you, speaking from a future drowned world, in an urgent attempt to communicate from that future with our present. Over the course of the 12 minutes, a sort of loose narrative develops, proposing our myths or messages from the future that will have been transmitted to us in the form of noise. That noise is then decoded into messages which are mistakenly understood as myths from the far past rather than images of an unknown future. It is a narrative about time and communication of information across time, but it's also about scale. So we'd like to play a bit of the video, and we can speak a bit more about it after that rolls.
No, but what I was going to say, because you were talking about how do we segue from the intertidal into protocols. And I think even though intertidal was thinking um, from a planetary scale, it was still pretty much the nexus was, or the focus of it was around Miami
Mm.
and certain kind of conditions specific to Miami. Whereas with protocols, I think we were trying to address like at a more planetary scale
Yeah.
how we need to be kind of adapting and what would you go
We should say what the protocols are.
yeah.
Patty, you want to show?
Also, in the
Protocols
meantime, put something forward about, again, intertidal to protocols. It seems like intertidal, in a way, trapped what the condition is currently, and the protocols, in a way, was a response to that.
Right, it's almost like a guide a guidepost or something. It's more projective of how to move forward within that condition.
I mean, I think the way I thought about it was like, what are the sort of, I don't know, I suppose like concepts that we find most urgent going forward. I mean, given climate change, given the pandemic, given, you know, all of it. I mean, even like the fact that all of our lives are sort of, so much of our lives are now in this format, you know, like, yes, we are, you know, we're not actually geographically all in the same place. But it wouldn't matter. Even if we were, we would still be talking on this. You know, technology in relationship to how we live, artificial intelligence. I mean, these are a lot of the things that the protocols raise.
It's called protocols for the phase transition. So
what is the phase transition?
So it's meant to get us. It's kind of. It is about a kind of liminal state. No, that this is trying to guide us into.
Between what and what, you think?
Between capitalism and whatever comes next.
The system we're in is just not tenable. I mean, I think the pandemic has shown that, you know, that the difference between those that have and those that don't is becoming greater and greater. And that something needs to be put in place. And I mean, this is the difficulty. I mean, one of the places where A.S.T started, which we haven't talked about actually, was this idea of secession, which is, you know, perhaps a rabbit hole, whether we want to go down it or not. But, you know, the idea of South
Let's
Florida.
go down it.
Yeah, you know, South Florida seceding from either from the rest of Florida or from the U.S. or, you know, because a lot of the alliances within Miami and within South Florida are as much with, you know, Latin and South America as they are with the U.S., you know, culturally, economically, and that perhaps secession would be the way forward.
Well, just to pick up on what you were saying, when we did this, the joint statement, we were, it was kind of prompted by more liberal calls for secession by South Florida government, you know, municipalities, like people in those municipalities that were trying to make a point about the urgency of climate change and the economic kind of the critical mass that was contained here in South Florida in response to North Florida's idea, or like trying to what's the word, ignore climate change, in fact making it not possible to even speak the word, the term. So it was when we wrote the joint statement, it was kind of prompted by more by South Florida municipalities that were more liberal leaning, that kind of that were angry about North Florida and Tallahassee not recognizing climate change and not recognizing also the economic kind of contribution of South Florida in relation to the larger state of Florida. And it was a way for them, they actually did declare secession as a statement, not as a serious kind of thing. And now what's interesting is on the right, it's a very right thing.
Mm-hmm.
Since the Trump since the election where Trump didn't win, where you hear of more right-wing states and municipalities talking about secession. But I think what we were discussing, what you and Felice and Patty were starting to play on was the idea of secession, of ecological secession, of maybe nature or just ecology finding some kind of a space of separation from us as perpetrators of whatever we've been perpetrating on it. I don't know. So I think that's what this is the line of thought. This is a thread that was coming up that you all brought up in our last discussion.
Do you think it's close to this idea of like lands and like rivers getting legal rights and things like this?
It's part of that. It's part of that. It came up when we were talking about Jeff Vandermeer and Area X and their trilogy. Like, not only there's a certain agency of ecology that it's and it also decenters us as the perpetrator. That it's not that it's us or them, or it's not about a separation per se, but maybe it is about some kind of autonomy or agency that's contained in the ecology that we haven't recognized, that is now explicit in terms of climate change and stuff.
I mean, it really goes to the history of the state. I mean, if you think about it, we were talking before about how the state essentially was dredged, in order to literally drain the swamp. And so that was the kind of early 20th century spirit of Florida, right? Was this kind of occupation and, if you want to call it, claim, if you would, it's like a manifest destiny idea that kind of was, well, we're going to dominate and we're going to own this place and we're going to make it what we need it to be. And now it's kind of bookended. I mean, the original quote, I guess, by Governor Broward back in the 20s, I think, was water is the common enemy. So, now what do we have today? Obviously, what you're getting at, Elite, which is kind of this other movement towards now, of course, kind of resuscitating the Everglades. But Patty, I'd like to hear you more sort of speak on this, because I know it's something you've been researching as well on your own.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I could add to what we're talking about is primarily, and I think the protocols for me was important in the sense that as we begin to move forward, what are the ideas that really, or like protocols or any like social, constructions that need to change, like just the way in which we view ourselves in relation to nature, right? At one point we had, it's like the environmental movement became a little very, very hippie and associated very much with like people that felt ideologically, had a different understanding with nature. But if you take it back even further, cultures have always had a deeply embedded relationship with nature. And I think one of the things that we investigate is how does that change and how do we begin to shift that change, right? So it's like, what this idea of an alliance, who is the alliance for? And like, not only just who, but who are we, like, what is the alliance, right? And can it be then something that's non-human, both technologically speaking and also in reference to nature, I think the other thing, it's like kind of, I think what Diane was drawing at earlier, which is the whole idea that like the agency given to nature, right? Is it to the extent where forests have laws specifically giving them that agency, I tend to agree, yes, but then I think we also need to think about what that means for technology as well.
Yeah, so can there be alliances between, you know, something like non-human animals and terraforming? You know,
Yeah.
like what would that look like? You know, what would the alliance between human and non-human animals look like? I mean, the fact that we have the agency and capacity to plan futures, change things on a planetary scale, for good and for ill. I mean, mostly for ill thus far, but you know, if we can destroy a planet, I have to believe that there's the capacity to sort of
Rebuild it.
well, I mean, do something sort of that can allow it to carry on with commitments beyond just human interests at heart. You know, that we do have the capacity to function planetarily, where a lot of species do not. A lot of species are going to be confined to the local and don't have the capacity of forethought and this sort of thing. So, I mean, I think that's where the alliances between human and non-human animals comes in, and where something like terraforming, and I'm picking that as like a, I don't know, a go-to, which is often sort of often seen as sort of very contrary to nature, but I don't necessarily think it's the case, to be honest. I mean, terraforming, like building back mangrove swamps, for example, is a form of, like, rewilding is a terraforming. You know, that sort of needs to be a technological process and a deliberate process.
I mean, it seems about to be somewhat about recognizing other intelligences beyond our own. And so to understand other intelligences, you have to understand their protocols and understand kind of the ways in which they operate. And I think those alliances, in my opinion, have something to do with that, because, I mean, in a way, it's about a kind of empathy towards other kind of forces or behaviors outside our own needs and wants. And I think that's definitely not been the approach, you know, for a long, long time with regard to human.
Yeah. And well, at the same time, I mean, I think one of the difficulties around this discourse too is that it ends up being, you know, if too much agency is sort of given to the non-human animal, whatever system that may be, then humans sort of end up off the hook. You know, like we sort of get out of, it's like our get out of jail free card somehow. You know, because if everything gets equalized, then somehow we're not responsible, and that's obviously not the case, and we are. And also, I mean, I think the alliances have to be not just with the non-human animals, but with other human animals that sort of are the ones that consistently get screwed. Basically, those that don't have economic agency. You know, this is going back to the problem of capitalism, I think.
Yeah, you're making me think that the idea of agency in terms of alliances also kind of decenters state-led leadership in terms of the political system at large, which we won't get into right now. But I mean, Elite, this goes back to so long ago. You want to go down that rabbit hole. But I just remember, Elite, who was we watched a video by a philosopher once in which, and I can't remember the name of the philosopher, but he was discussing the idea of how we're reliant upon our politicians, where originally that wasn't the case. The idea of the Senate or the town hall, or, you know, that sort of structure had to do with people actually, you know, actively contributing and actively taking, as you say, Diane, responsibility, really, rather than say, okay, I'm just going to vote for this particular person and my needs and wants will be met. So this ties into not just capitalism, but also the sort of institutions of just statehood in general and politics, which is, ooh, that's a rabbit hole.
Yeah, but I think you have to have something like it. I mean, I don't know. It is a rabbit hole. I mean, but I feel like there's got to be something like a state, but not necessarily defined as it is currently, because to deal with scale, you need, you know, you need sort of a system that can deal with abstraction. And I don't know what, I mean, it can't be down to the individual, you know,
This
because
goes back to, like, you know, ancient Rome and the kind of issue of, you know, the Nero syndrome, where you've got, you know, a Senate, and then you've got, you know, the emperor, you know. And so I just think that, and I agree. So basically, I agree with you, of course. And alliances really has to do with also the kind of abstraction of how to actually maneuver an alliance. But I don't know, lately it just seems, at least in terms of, of politics lately, there's just a lot being sort of put into the Nero kind of model rather than the Senate. And the Senate actually, in terms of the states at least, is no model right now to go by. But yes, agreed.
And I think that's what's tricky about the protocols, is because we're trying to it's like we're trying to map out something that doesn't exist, that that, you know, like in terms of, you were talking about, do we repair the planet, do we rewild certain areas, do we, you know, I think also the terraforming implies that there's like other conditions, like new conditions that are more synthetic, that are more of these kind of mixes that we haven't seen before, that haven't operated together before. So it's like, I don't, so yeah, like in terms of that goes also for governments, or that both have to work at a planetary scale, because otherwise you just not having enough impetus to make any kind of changes. But also does have to work at the individual scale too, is the problem with it, because it's a person by person enterprise
Yeah, and
to
I think that's,
transition.
to like build on what you're saying, Elite, like I think that's what I found really interesting as the protocols, as an exercise for us to think about how we, these, with technology, we have the opportunity, right? This idea that like we can be networked at a scale that we haven't been, right? So then how can we then use, in a way, it's like I'm going to tie in 2 points. It's like not only as an exercise to how we can oscillate between the local to more of planetary networks, but also what does the art world do, right? Like why have this conversation within the art world? And I think, you know, and that's something that was fundamental for us from the beginning, right? Which is this idea that like within the art world, we have this play where we can talk about things that feel so wildly beyond our control, right? Like a political system like the Senate. You know, it's like, who doesn't experience political apathy? You know, I have no idea, like it's beyond my control. Even like the idea of climate change is so beyond my ability to reason and understand, that I can actually, besides recycling, what can I really do? And I think the art world gives us this like platform in where we can speculate, where we can draw from something very real and have the ability to imagine it differently.
And
and
you
I
can
say
get
this
people to
only
talk
to,
as well.
sorry, say that again.
I mean, you can get people talking as well. I mean, this is, I think, what,
Yeah.
you know, we've found. I mean, this goes back to the BFI project we did a couple of years ago. I mean, where you, as an artist, you can sort of say to various experts, you know, we're interested in this. Will you come talk to us and this other person about it? And I think, you know, the idea with this project that we've got up now, this was getting a climate modeler, mayor of South Miami, if I can remember the whole, engineer for Miami Beach, curator, the 4 of us. Who am I leaving out?
KSR.
KSR. Unfortunately, he wasn't there in person, so maybe that's why he's not. But I would have loved to have had him there in person, because I actually think he would, his KSR is Kim Stanley Robinson. Sorry, we sort of ended up calling him KSR between ourselves through that whole thing. So it's sort of a shorthand for us. But you know, he's a science fiction writer and sort of writes what I think is true science fiction, which is sort of very informed, well researched with regard to the science. fiction. So it does that thing of speculating that I think the art field can do, whether that's writing or whether that's sort of visual arts or whatever. But anyway, getting all these people in a room together to, you know, to have a conversation slightly outside of their comfort zone whilst bringing in their own individual expertise. I mean, I think that's what the art field can do. And then, you know, take from that and sort of try out new ideas that and new combinations of things that is harder to do within engineering, because you have, you know, a very important there's a rigor that's very important within sort of urban engineering, for example, but you don't necessarily need that level within the art field. You can sort of play around a bit and ideas can be a bit more slippery. And I think that can then feed back into reality in a real way, that it couldn't have gotten there on its own, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it definitely does. The other thing I find really interesting about our practice, right, is that we're constantly reflecting on language in some form or another, you know, like something like the intertidal, you know, just kind of briefly going back to that for a second, like the idea of the intertidal is we're really that liminal space, that it's an actual physical space, but for us, beyond that, it became, we interpret it differently, right? Like in this slide that we have in front of us, it's like the contemporary coast. Like some, for maybe within the art world can be maybe the play of language is something more people are accustomed to, but what I like is this, once again, it's like this transdisciplinary slip that we tend to do, right? You know, we're drawing from so many different sources. And I think that might be a nice thing to talk about, is like kind of how we're like, even something as like water as a distributed system, like how we begin this process of collecting and examining language and then almost flipping it for different reasons or different trajectories.
Before that, we should probably actually say what BFI was, because I realized we didn't. This is one of the dangers of talking internally, is we know what we're talking about. We don't necessarily explain it for people that might be watching. So BFI was a Bass Fisher Institute, supported us.
Bass Fisher Invitational,
sorry. Invited us to do this project where we got these people that I mentioned before together in a room for a all-day workshop, but then we also had a public event in the evening. And we did it sort of as a closed door thing and then a public thing to sort of see what the difference would be. And it was interesting. It was a very different feel. You know, it sort of felt like during the day when it was a closed door thing, we were able to sort of get to territory that, you know, people may not have been comfortable speaking about in public. You know, in public, people have their public spiel that they do, and they sort of have their professional sort of shtick. Whereas talking to in a more informal setting was actually really interesting. We ended up talking about poop, actually, which was much more interesting than it sounds. But
the main problem,
huh?
It ended up being like, I think that it was a very simple question, like, what is one of the biggest things we face in the more immediate, right? Because like we had divided that workshop, the internal, so I don't know if we said this already, but it was an internal workshop for the first half day, and then it was a public presentation for the end of the day. And the internal, we had divided it between segments of time, right? So it's like chunks of like what happens within the next 25, 50 to 100 years. And, you know, something that's very important to us is how, you know, the future speaks to the present and how the present is yet to come. Like, so I think we had structured it around that type of time frame. And the simple question was, what is, I think, the most immediate problem that we're going to be facing? And that's where poop came up, waste management.
Because basically, I mean, just to summarize, I mean, in Miami, so much of Miami houses have individual septic systems rather, not septic systems, they're septic systems, rather than a citywide sort of system. And when the water table rises, these no longer function. And so, you know, on an individual basis, all of these are going to have to be replaced as the water table comes up, you know, because there's always these visions of like a submerged Miami with this beautiful turquoise aqua blue sort of water, so, you know, that's coming up around these high rises, and it's still very beautiful and very sort of Caribbean and you know, gorgeous, but actually it's just going to be like shit filled water, you know, and it's not going to be beautiful, it's not going to be pretty. And I think this conversation was actually really interesting because it brought home the, you know, it crashed this reality into this sort of you know, this fantasy image of the flooded city that you could somehow swim through or snorkel through downtown.
Dystopian fantasy.
Yeah.
But I think I sent you that article where it says they've known about this problem since the 50s. And then again in the 70s, they were warned, don't put septic systems in porous limestone geology. And yet it was done. And so, and I don't know if any, like the issue of accountability seems to be something that defines like the current condition as, you know, this taking responsibility. But there's like, I know all this is going to get cut out because this is going way too long, but I just wanted to bring it up in terms of like, why as artists, why are we looking at this stuff? Like, why is it that we are constantly drawn to these having chats with climate modelers and engineers, or like, it's not like we're looking to create a portrait or particular, like a conventional kind of art piece that is going to inhabit a space in a museum or something. It's like, I think there's a certain kind of accountability or a questioning about what our roles are as artists. Patty was already referring to it. There's a certain kind of freedom that we have to explore ideas that, like, that the engineer can't. It's too politically charged, and he's too accountable to too many people to be able to kind of test ideas. But I think a lot of what we're doing is kind of interested in taking the kind of accountabilities or questions that people like those engineers or like the city manager has to be thinking about, but try to rethink them through or open them up as questions from an art space that might be able to, I don't know what I'm trying to say here.
I'm going to riff on that because actually you're getting at something else, I think, to maybe go off into another direction here, which is the idea of just thinking systemically and drawing out systemically within the practice, but also just practicing systemically. How does that look? How does that feel, dare I say? You know, what is that art practice about? And I think that we're kind of exploring it, and we've been asking that question, I think, for a long time, which is, you know, we're not, as you said, Ali, just sort of concerned with affect or the appearance of things. You know, we go to the root of the problem. And I think, you know, we're still kind of working our way through this as a practice, but I think the systemic aspect of what we're interested in it makes it interesting with regard to, I think, how we think.
Yeah, or the affect becomes the strategy to communicate those systemic kind of ideas and relationships, and not an end in itself.
Yeah, I think, and also that, I mean, it sort of feels like it, between us, it goes without saying, but I don't know if it does go without saying, sort of still within the art world, that, you know, moving away from the individual artist, like as like this sort of like hero figure or sort of some grand figure. I mean, I think working collaboratively between the four of us, but then also sort of branching out again with these alliances that we try to build, is sort of really important part of what the practice is. It's, you know, methodologically important, as well as ideologically important.
I will bring up an affect moment, which I think you all know about from Intertidal, when I think there were some tours that that were visiting, and there was a high school tour. And at one point, you know, we asked, you know, what do you think? You know, what any questions? And there was one young high school girl who just said, "I'm just overwhelmed." That is what she said about experiencing that exhibition. And I think, you know, that was a story you guys know about, but I think that also circles back to, I guess, Ali, what you just pointed out, which is there is an affect actually to also what we do. And there's a potency in both of those things, the kind of systemic aspect and the affect aspect.
But again, as Elise said, it's like utilizing affect rather than having it be an end in its own right. You're utilizing it as a tool
As a
to do
tool.
something.
Although that was unexpected, but interestingly so. Interestingly so.
Mm-hmm.
Not totally unexpected. I mean, in a way, that was kind of our intention, because, you know, we had the whole thing with the, you know, it being like a control center that you can't control. So, I mean, in a way, that one of the aims was to have this sort of overwhelming, too much information kind of thing. So, it wasn't totally unexpected.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. At what point do we want to pivot to something about the Everglades, even if it's just 5 to 10 minutes, about how we're thinking about?
Well, now seems good.
Go for it.
I mean, it's funny. I'm a little intimidated by the Everglades thing. I have very little. I probably have the least experience of the Everglades of the four of us, and I am the furthest away as well. But I think this idea of thinking of it around like the Vandermeer kind of way, like an Area X that sort of might claim its autonomy, whether we like it or not, you know, almost as a character itself.
Yeah, I like thinking of it in that way because it gives it a kind of potency and mystery and power that sometimes gets lost when we think of it as a national park or part of the national park system, which is great, but there's something. It's definitely more fierce and powerful than that place, and it'd be nice to kind of start to uncover some of the kind of latent power inside of it. You know,
I think one of the, on first impression, it seems quite unassuming in a way because it's so flat.
yeah.
You know, it's not like the sort of violent, sort of majestic beauty of mountains or something like this. It's like it's unrelenting and it's just flatness, and it's a whole world that can swallow you.
But you know, I mean, I love that description because like one of the things you always see are these sort of like drone over like flyovers where you just see the kind of surface, and you can tell like with all of the grass that it's just water, and it means that it doesn't need us. Like there's no ground to stand on, you know, and there's a whole kind of, again, this sort of intelligence of the way that ecosystem operates that has nothing to do with us. Which we've impacted, of course, but it is interesting in that way that it is unassuming on the surface, but you know, just the idea that there's really no solid ground there for me is interesting. Just thinking about the kind of anthroposition of the vertical and the kind of way in which we need to stand. And so, you know, the beginning of that documentary, The Swamp, they visually go through just all the dredging that was attempted to do early on, and just it all failed miserably. And just the sort of scale of it and just how insane actually it really was. So yeah, I like what you're saying, guys, about the kind of latent potency that, you know, it assumes its own entity in a way. And also just the fact in the beginning that nobody wanted to come here. Like nobody wanted to occupy the island. It was considered just this awful place, which is very different than the narrative today, to your point, Ali.
But also what you guys are talking about is it's also maybe exploring a couple of different kinds of conditions, because there is the condition of the Everglades as this autonomous, mysterious realm. And then there's like us that come in and dredge it and are violent towards it. And then there's this other kind of condition since the restoration, which is this kind of reparative condition, but it's where we're irrigating, we're engineering the swamps to be swamps in a way. But also it seems like we're also kind of looking at what's like another condition that would happen that would give it a certain kind of, it would claim some of its autonomy, or like, I don't, not dredge, because we don't want to, but maybe there's some kind of other synthetic kind of relationship or condition that would emerge, and what that might look like, and what because that's also
in the Everglades.
Yeah, because part of the thing about alliances is that they're not necessarily clean ones, or that they, you know, they might be messy.
All parties must give something up in the process of negotiation.
And change, and be changed in the process, right? That you don't come out of it the same. The nature isn't just nature, and we're, you know, humans aren't just humans anymore. That it becomes kind of a little more embedded, and, or something else. Yeah, I think that's probably something that we'll be approaching the Everglades with, right? Trying to see it through strange new eyes, or trying to, I don't know.
I mean, like, I'm not really like very much interested in like knowing more about how it was like like how people developed it, or how, like, I just find that, like, we know, at least it's like I feel like I understand they do what everybody else does, right? Which is go in, claim it, and it's my territory. It's like the same thing. I think it's like, what can we learn between understanding the system itself, right? Like the swamp as a system, as another system with its own way of being, that's been eons before we came onto the earth. And and what can we learn from it, and how can we change because of it? I think also a lot about like how important it is to study it, right? Because something as, when we're talking about how the scope of it, right, how long it is, right, how massive it is, right? So it's like down south, like anything that happens in North Florida affects the Everglades in South Florida, right? So it's like these systems that are interconnected function much the same, you know, much the same as like a body functions, you know, like I think about that all the time.
But you know, you're actually getting to I mean, Patty, you're making me think of the old maps of Florida, where you actually see the watershed actually spilling. I mean, I think even north of Lake Okeechobee is where the waters start to flow, and then they flow into Okeechobee, and then the overflow, right, became the watershed. So if you look at the old maps of Florida, the entire state down it's the claw, guys. I mean, it was the claw. So, you know, it was this sort
Just
of
for the
split.
record, the claw is a version of Florida that when the water comes in, the land that's left looks like a
It's
claw.
what's left.
So you've got a
It's our greeting.
Yeah.
You know, but to your point, I mean, it's massive.
Yeah.
The tattoo helps too. Yeah, I mean, it's true. It's a massive, massive system that has its own, again, its own intelligence. And you're right, Patty. There's so much to actually to understand about it and learn from it. And do you think we have, or do you think we have a lot more to learn, basically?
I feel like it's almost like relearning. Like in a way, it's like if I think about, like, one of the facts that I really like about the swamp and about the relationship between the native indigenous cultures that were here, the swamp was there. The swamp protected them, right? When like the Spanish became to arrive, and like and I find from that perspective also quite interesting, like how this like area that is yeah, it's like when you're out there, it's flat. There's no place to stand in. There's water. There's like, it's mucky. Like when you step into the swamp, you could feel it eating you. Like you could feel it swallowing you, right? Like you put your foot in there and it's just, you're sinking in like, yeah, exactly. Like the claw, actually.
It's grabbing.
An amorphous claw of mush and bacteria and soot. Yeah, so I guess, you know, I feel like there's different ways to understand it, and different positions in which to understand it from. Like I mean, and I hopefully, I'm sure we'll learn more about the Everglades this year. But I also think about like it's the mushroom system, it's mycelia, right? So the mycelia grows in forests, and it grows in roots of like of the trees, right? So it goes in and the network, it creates such a vast network, and it functions much like the internet does, right? It's like, and I wonder like what type of systems within the swamp do things like that there, like or how it's like somehow connected, like what part of it is alive, which I have no idea what that answer is. Well, maybe the AIRIE specialists.
Or maybe the question isn't even around what's alive or what isn't, because information can get transmitted sort of through things that are not alive as well. I mean, I guess, I mean, this brings us back to our main theme, I suppose, which is water as a distributed system. You know, we were doing this other project called Weird Miami that we were thinking about. We were asked to sort of pick a site in South Florida, and for that site, we just picked water, so it takes us everywhere as like a single site, but like it affects everything. And then certainly part of the Everglades. I mean, I think we'll sort of get a greater understanding of how that works, hopefully, when we're there. I suppose to circle back around to where we started at the beginning, this, you know, one of the problems of global climate change is a time problem, you know, that we live in very localized time, you know, the time of a lifetime of like, you know, the longest planning is like a 30-year mortgage, for example. You know, a long time is in human terms is a blip, you know, and whereas, you know, climate change happens in these vast timescales, and I think there is an urgency with of trying to make non-human time more intimate. Again, back to this question of using affect as a tool rather than an end in itself. You know, like to make the intimacy that we already have with deep time palpable seems an important task. Because it is we already do have an intimacy with it. I mean, if you've you know, been burning fossil fuels for 200 years, and that's going to affect the climate for 10,000 years into the future, whether we, you know, even if we stop burning everything right now, it's already like cooked in. So you know, that intimacy with time outside of experience is already part of our life, but it's not felt. You know, it's not palpable. You know, when you fill up your tank of your car, you don't, you know, I'm just trying to get from here to there. I'm not trying to you know, burn dinosaurs and kill my grandchildren, for example. But I mean, I'm not that you know, I don't mean to be so like condemnatory of it. I'm certainly not in the position of like we all have to go back to some state of nature. It's a nonsense, I think.
It's just about claiming it, I think. It's just about claiming that, claiming that into that relationship to deep time.
Yeah.
We just don't think about it, or we don't want to think about it. And it's like, when you're bringing it up, it's not saying that it's a moral, it's not judging it per se. I mean, it's definitely, it's saying it's going to end us sooner than later. But that's our choice of how we, move forward with that. I think it's just that you're making, like you're saying, you're making it visible, you're claiming it, and then I guess, finding ways through that. I don't know. Now I don't know what I'm saying at all. I don't know.
I mean, I want to add something maybe on a tangent. I read this article this weekend was sort of speculating on the fact that, like, where are other advanced civilizations, right, in the Milky Way? And, we're like kind of, we're on the fringes actually of the Milky Way. We're like, way out in Booney Land. So, the article is speculating that most developed civilizations would be more towards the middle when it formed, right? Because they're just, from a time scale perspective, more advanced than we are. But that most of them have probably self-annihilated. And, I never heard that theory, because I always sort of thought, well, if you're an advanced civilization, you're going to figure this shit out. You're not just going to keep extracting until you freaking kill yourself. But, it begs the question to what you're saying, which is like, are we just going to keep extracting until we can extract no more? And, it's...
I think we will. I do.
Unless we...
Cheers, Patty, come on.
No.
I think, and I don't know, this is totally on a tangent, completely, but I think until we know how to deal with evil, until we take that into account, like in our just operations.
Oh, Ali, that's such a can of worms you've opened. What does that mean?
Yeah, totally. It's because it's a dynamic force. It cannot be contained. It can just be managed, but we don't really deal with it. When we do governments, it's about how, how things should be. But maybe if there was like a department, not that you could have a department of evil management. But it is
probably already
our next project.
It's like, we want to pretend it's not there. I think part of the fallacy of progress is this idea that we're getting better and better. But but that's just a piece of it. And the evil is inside. We can manage it internally, but to manage it on a civilization scale, it takes a lot of what's the word? Agility? I don't know. You got to be. So it's always going to be that wrestling match. And it's just, yeah.
Would you say that's an inherently human thing?
Yeah, but it's also, I don't know, it's like a bigger force. It's some other kind of bigger universal force, and it's easier, like.
It goes along with entropy. It to what you're saying is like, oh well, we have to sustain. It's based on sustaining oneself, right, in the easiest fashion possible. So the only way to do that is to just do the things that we know best, and the path of least resistance, right?
Right.
And in a way, it's at some point you have to account for the path of least resistance, because that's not sustainable.
Right, which is why the power of positive thinking doesn't work, because you have to deal with the negative thinking too. Like you need to deal with it. So it's the darkness. It's the darkness. We got to deal with that. And maybe that's where the swamp will help us. I don't know. Like, just there's a lot hidden in there that, yeah.
Well, Patty, I'm curious. I'm going to poke you a little bit on this. Why do you think it's a failed project to think we could change?
I think I just don't see. We've lived so long on the basis of extraction, right? Like modern society, the way, and from like, the Industrial Revolution till today, I don't see it's primarily been off extraction and extracting things, whether it's people, whether it's land, whether it's like different forms of like, I don't know, I just, every time any type of progress is brought up, it's usually some sort of extractive form. And it's like something as simple as oil, right? We continue to dredge for oil when, I mean, I think it's somewhat understood that there's probably a limit to that oil, right? And what happens once it's no longer there? What does that do to the fundamental structure of Earth? Let's say, like, you know, because now I'm talking on a scale I don't fully understand, but I just don't see us as humans being able to do anything different other than what we've continued to do.
That we're just destined for annihilation.
That's the perspective
No, I can't have that.
See, Diane, we need your xenofeminist perspective here on how we could leverage technology in a nice leftist accelerationist way. You want to expand on that, please?
I don't know. I mean, on one level, I agree. I'm not hugely optimistic, but in a way, I don't know, maybe this is the project. It's like you recognize the darkness and you keep going anyway. Because what else are you going to do? I mean, just stop and accept that it's, you know.
I agree, actually, but I agree in the sense that what I'm not saying is that I'm not, like, it's not that I'm not hopeful that we will continue to develop modes out of like maybe something like climate change, right? I just don't think in the long run, I just have a sense that humans, unless we radically change the way in which we live in relationship to the planet, to the earth, like I just don't see us in the long term, like beyond our lifetime, beyond our kids' lifetimes. Like I don't see, I just can't see it happening. I can't see people changing. Like,
well, I mean, I
as
think
simple as
eventually
cars.
it's all going to go anyway. Like, that's for sure. Like, if we're talking like grand scale, like definitely, like sun's going to expand. It's all, you know, whatever.
Yeah.
Sounds very melancholia.
Well, I mean, it's just physics, you know. It's you know, it is what it is. But like, in the meantime, I mean, I did this video piece that actually included a lot of A.S.T stuff. I may have even called it an A.S.T project, which was politics as the palliative care of the species. So, like, accepting that we're going down, let's go down in like the least painful way possible. You know, like let's make it as just as possible. And you know, there is something to like the long arc of justice, you know, like I don't know.
Well,
I mean, I do think broadly things are better now than they were 200 years ago.
Yeah.
Why politics? Like, why? I'm curious about the title.
Why politics?
Mm-hmm.
Because I think it's how humans structure relationships to each other and the world they live in. And it's how scalable protocols actually can be put in place.
Well, you know, it's a lovely example to look at what we're dealing with in the States with the last 4 years. I mean, so the question is, because, you know, you've got an emperor wannabe on his way out, thank God now, but, you know, basically using, I guess, a scalable technology like Twitter, you know, to broadcast, you know, messages. And yes, it's been quite effective. So, but, you know, the thing is, to me, this talks to me about the short term versus the long term, because I think the political systems as they are, for the most part, are really kind of based on short term returns. and power. I mean, there's obviously that, but short-term returns is really about the idea of what can you do to hold on to power, but also what can you do to create, wins for whatever the election cycle is. So, if you're talking about politics being the most scalable sort of way of implementing change, then, and I agree, the one thing that the Trump presidency has taught me, at least, is that it is scalable to get across to millions of people. It's scalable. So the question is, is it scalable in a different way?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think it definitely is. I mean, you have, something like the NHS as an example. I mean, that's a political decision. You can implement universal health care. It's done through politics.
But that's different than what I'm talking about. I mean, you're talking about being able to,
But that's what I mean when I say politics. I don't mean sort of, American party politics. That's, I mean, that's.
I understand, but we could take actually Great Britain as an example as well with Brexit. I mean, that's a scalable politic right there. I mean, it's one thing, I think, to scale, what you would want to call safety nets and such. But I guess I'm talking about convincing, the art of convincing. I mean, this goes back to what, Patty, you're talking about. If you can't convince people to do, say, the just thing, and then, of course, there's people who are so programmed into thinking the just thing is not what we think is the just thing. So there's propaganda, right? And then there's the just thing. And I just, I don't know. I guess I've come out of the past 4 years realizing if you talk to someone who's on the other side of your political point of view, they'll think you're crazy. So, I mean, I think it is scalable. That's the one thing in the positive I could say, wow, you can really convince, what do we have? Almost 100 million, 80 million people voted for Biden, and how many people voted for Trump? A lot as well. So that's a lot of people. And I mean, okay, so then how do we mobilize that? How do we mobilize that? And how do we get everybody on the same page? And that to me is just unbelievable.
More importantly than getting everyone on the same page is like, how do you get just policies through accepting that you're not going to get everyone on the same page?
Yeah.
Because that's not going to happen. Right?
How do we create alliances to even agree upon what that is?
Yeah. How do you bridge differences? And where do you find the commonalities? You're right.
Which is the opposite of where it's been the past year. It's been just let's divide and conquer. I mean, it's classic.
Yeah. Well.
Yeah. It's a lot easier to do that.
I don't know. I don't know. I think I sort of sit in this sort of it's like a dark optimism, I suppose. It's sort of, I mean, it does go, it is related to the xenofeminist thing. I know it was sort of mentioned in passing, but there is something around, there's a certain liberation, I guess, in sort of, in a certain kind of nihilism that, accepts extinction of the species. But also, I think but I think it's too easy. It's too like the easy thing is to just sort of accept that it's all going to go to shit, right? I mean, because it's like the entropy problem. I mean, that's like the tendency of nature is
right. We'll just roll with it.
Apart.
And that's where evil kind of steps in. It finds an easy. It lubricates us like that with that. Maybe that's all it is there's just like finding meaning is just trying to that fight or that challenge of finding of bridging differences or making our way towards annihilation in a more just and beautiful way. Maybe that is the project. That's the project. Like that makes the day-to-day process meaningful you know?
I think that's probably like the best place to end it on, limping towards annihilation in the most just and beautiful way possible.
I
I think
like
that's
that as
Yeah,
our
yeah, that's a good
claim.
cue.
Mhm.
Should
Oh
we
my
leave it
God,
there?
how long did we go on for?
A long
It's
time.
been a, yeah, it's been a while.
Bye.